Welcome to Living History Channel, folks. You are about to find out who was Tutankhamun and what was life like during the New Kingdom of Egypt era in which he ruled? What was the significance of the Nile River in ancient Egypt's agriculture and trade? And how did Tutankhamun's reign impact trade relations with neighboring civilizations? Additionally, what was the structure of the ancient Egyptian army during Tutankhamun's reign? How did the pharaoh spend his evenings and nights, and what were some of the common activities that pharaohs engaged in to entertain themselves? And what was the significance of Tutankhamun's tomb discovery in 1922? Today, we're going to live a day in the life of a real Egyptian pharaoh. It's a bit unusual because most of the time we talk about the lives of ordinary working men, but variety never hurts, and ancient Egypt is a very interesting topic. But let us also note in advance that from the point of view of the pharaohs, our guest will be the most ordinary, unremarkable, and can be said to be pathetic. Unfortunately, everything connected with ancient Egypt begins with the prefix probably. For even scientists with scientific degrees cannot be sure of the predictions connected with the history of Egypt. The reason is obvious. Time. Just think of the fact that ancient Egypt was older for the ancient Romans than the ancient Romans are for us. The legendary Cleopatra lived closer to the first human spaceflight than she did to the time of the Great Pyramids. Cleopatra was born in 69th year BC and is separated from Gagarin's flight by 1993 years. And at the same time, the Great Pyramid of Giza was built in 2540 BC, and therefore 2,470 years before the birth of Cleopatra. But Cheops and his pyramids are not even the beginning of Egyptian history. The first state formations in the territory appeared 1,000 years earlier in the year 3500 BC, and the last records in Egyptian hieroglyphics were written in 300 AD. In order for you to understand the analogy to equal ancient Egypt in historical longevity, in the modern United States it is required to exist somewhere else 3,556 years. That's not a bad figure, is it? Therefore, any material about ancient Egypt should be treated with caution. 90% of the records of that era have not yet been found, and of those that have been found, only a fraction has been deciphered. Nevertheless, we have tried to select for you the facts in which historians agree. So meet the pharaoh Tutankhamun, in the skin of which we will live the entire day. It's about 1324 AD, and Egypt is in what's called the New Kingdom of Egypt era. By this point, the civilization is 2,000 years old and at its peak. Our Tutankhamun rules Upper and Lower Egypt. He is only 18, but for pharaohs, youth is not a hindrance. Tutankhamun ascended the throne at 10, and 3 years later he was already making very conscious political decisions, albeit with the help of servants. To begin with, let us define the sphere of power. We mentioned Upper and Lower Egypt for a reason. Practically all the history of the kingdom, they were divided, either spoken or unspoken. Lower Egypt is a more favorable land in the valley of the Nile, bordering the Mediterranean Sea. Upper Egypt is lower and mostly concentrated right on the banks of the river, for as you understand, moving away from the Nile a couple of kilometers in Africa, you meet the desert. And yep, you heard right. Upper Egypt is indeed lower than Lower Egypt. Anyway, instead of the savanna that reigned in Africa 6,000 years ago, the people of Upper Egypt faced desertification due to climate change and were determined to survive. Scientists are inclined to the opinion that eventually the king of Upper Egypt, nicknamed King of the Scorpions, conquered Lower Egypt, forming a unified state. With varying success since then, Egypt is intact and ruled by our Tutankhamun. And the crown of Shent is the embodiment of this. It is a combination of two crowns. The red crown of Shent represented Lower Egypt, and the white hedjet, Upper Egypt. Often in bas-reliefs and drawings, the pharaoh was depicted between two goddesses wearing separate crowns, who gave them to the pharaoh. Because, as it is not difficult to guess, for ancient Egyptians the pharaoh was even more than a mere representative of the gods. He was their guide, and the sacred duty of every Egyptian was to give pharaoh everything. For the richer and more beautiful pharaoh was, the richer and more beautiful every inhabitant of Egypt would become, perhaps not in this life, but certainly in the afterlife. So every day of the pharaoh was a real ceremony. As soon as our Tutankhamun opened his eyes, the cronies immediately played a hymn of the rising sun to the whole neighborhood. Special cronies organized a bath of rose water. In the presence of the family and cronies, Pharaoh had his makeup applied, his hair groomed, and his wig picked up. For except for a short beard, many pharaohs, including our Tutankhamun, shaved bald and used fancy wigs with jewelry. And since the pharaoh is the personification of wealth, there was a lot of jewelry. Tutankhamun was more like a walking piece of gold and precious stones. Then he went to the chapel of Osiris, where he prayed, used incense, and washed the statue. On his way out, Tutankhamun left the doors of the temple open so that grace might extend throughout Egypt. And at the same time, he personally appointed the priests, for the temple of Osiris was an extremely important place. After a sumptuous breakfast in the dining room, where in addition to the pharaoh food was served to the statues of his ancestors of the dynasty, Tutankhamun began to work. And this is the most interesting detail, because for all piety and worship of the pharaoh, ancient Egypt was a very flexible state, with an advanced system of management. The pharaoh had a vizier, a personal advisor who substituted for him in dealing with business matters. There was a cabinet of ministers, a treasurer, a judge, a chief of police, and other officials. All of them kneeled before Tutankhamun, who listened to reports after a hearty breakfast. It is not necessary to romanticize the situation. A good half of the kneeling ministers wove intrigues, stole and minded their own business. Pharaoh's power was absolute, but one man could not cope at all. Much of the success of the rule depended on the quality of the advisors chosen by the pharaoh. The father of our Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, recruited idiots and tried to have a religious revolution. He appointed Aten as the main god instead of Amen, which people didn't like. Actually, our Tutankhamun was named Tutankhaten from birth, for that very reason. It translates as living image of Aten. But after becoming a pharaoh, our guy changed course to the classical one that brought power to Egypt. Amun-Ra, god of air and sun, was again the supreme god. His temples reopened, and the priests began to receive funding. In fact, decrees like this one were issued by our Tutankhamun at morning meetings. In addition, great attention was paid to trade. Egypt, like many powers of the time, was for the most part an agricultural state. The only difference was that the Egyptians took full advantage of the Nile River. They built canals, devised irrigation mechanisms, and as a consequence, food was plentiful. They traded it with neighboring Babylon, Assyria, the southern African states, and of course the northern Greek neighbors on the Mediterranean Sea. Our Tutankhamun was even in Crete once for a short visit. By the way, the Egyptians traded black slaves, ivory, and other goods of South Africa, thanks to their good location. The Egyptians had mastered seafaring to perfection, for goods were most easily transported directly by the Nile River. The period of the New Kingdom is considered the most powerful point in the life of the Egyptian Empire. But Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten, did manage, thanks to his shitty advisors, to ruin the army and lose Syria. Tutankhamun is thinking about going to kick the unwashed Hittites' asses, but it's a little early for that. Ramses II will do it a little later, and our Tutankhamun is still manning the army. There were no traditional barracks in ancient Egypt. Armies were simply taken and settled in dangerous areas. Of course, it was most often a base, for one would not expect the Ethiopians in the south to be a threat. Inside, police officers, either recruited from the conquered tribes or hired. By the way, in addition to bows, the ancient Egyptian army of our Tutankhamun's time often included swords, war chariots, and lances. No one fought on sticks anymore. Well, as for the pharaoh's day, after a grueling meeting he went to rest. It was believed that during his rest all pharaoh's dreams would be telling, so advisors were on duty next to him, who immediately wrote down Tutankhamun's dreams and decrees. When there were no dreams, the pharaoh just kept giving out errands. They mostly concerned the construction of new temples, ancestral statues, and other archaeological sites. Well, after resting, the pharaoh would sit in a stretcher. The stretcher would be taken by his personal guard, and our Tutankhamun would be taken out for a walk. During the walk, Pharaoh stood on the terrace and blessed all four sides of the world. The blessing was accompanied by the roar of trumpets, and all who heard it raised their flags, fell on their knees, and prayed, according to the domino principle, for it was believed that to catch that moment was a lucky ticket. There have even been cases where thieves and murderers have claimed that their sentence was passed at the blessing of Pharaoh, and in this case, the judgment was mitigated, and during the blessed speech of Pharaoh, it was forbidden to hurt even animals, for such could even come the death penalty, for the life of Tutankhamun is sacred, and the Pharaoh's touch was equated with a ticket to life. Very rarely, while walking or resting in the garden, the Pharaoh could call a child or an adult to him. If Tutankhamun touched him at that moment, word would spread in a second. In this way, one could become an official, a respected person, or even a priest, because a pharaoh was never wrong. Well, in the evening the pharaoh usually returned to the dining room where he again ate with the statues of gods and ancestors. They literally put the food to the stones and apparently entrusted special people to eat it. For afterwards, what the gods and past pharaohs supposedly had not eaten was taken out to the courtiers. In the meantime, the pharaohs entertained with dances, women, and circus acts. At the end of the day, Tutankhamun returned to the temple of Osiris, nodded to the priests who had left him in the morning, and put the god to sleep. The doors would be sealed until the next morning, and our pharaoh would go to bed. Few things interrupted this same routine. Mostly it might have been trips. Pharaohs liked to change capitals like clocks. Akhenaton, meanwhile, founded the city of Akhenaton, naming it his capital. Our Tutankhamun was born there, but when he became pharaoh, he moved to Memphis and declared it the capital. However, at that time, anything was called the capital. Thebes was considered to be the center of Upper Egypt, which Tutankhamun quite often visited, because the patron of Thebes was exactly Amun, whose name was borne by our pharaoh. In fact, not far from Thebes, in a place called the Valley of Kings, Tutankhamun ordered to build his sanctuary, which became a tomb. But you know that for the pharaohs, this is commonplace. And it was the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 that was the real sensation, for its contents were almost untouched. The golden mask that was found inside became a symbol of Egypt and is probably known to everyone. Well, in reality, many historians claim that the only memorable event related to Tutankhamun is that he lived and died. Because this pharaoh was the most ordinary of all. His descendant Ramses would conquer Syria. His ancestor Hatshepsut bent half of Asia and built up the whole country. Tutankhamun was an unremarkable pharaoh, a day in whose skin we have just lived. If you want to see more videos about ancient Egypt, don't forget to like this video, write a comment, and subscribe to our channel. See you again, folks!